Hello and welcome to Power and Perspective. I am April. I should have tested this. I am April. This is Aaron.
Nailed it.
And we are here to reframe conversations with empathy and humor. Today we have, last time was backwards. So today we have
Yep, nailed it.
Carly Souza.
2 for 2.
Woohoo, to talk with us about the upside of foster care. Hello, Carly. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to do this with you guys tonight.
Yes, we are excited as well, and excited to hear about the other side of foster care that we haven't heard about, because you always hear the negative stuff a lot. And this will be a very nice balance. So just to share with regards to foster care, anything that I know, growing up, before Aaron came along, my parents did a lot of foster care. My mom was a nurse, and so we did medically fragile foster care for kids. I had a foster brother who had Down syndrome who hated me with a passion. Yeah, there's many stories about that. And I don't know if this has to do with foster care, but I did CASA for a time being and worked with a family that was in the foster care system. So that's my experience of foster care in general. And Aaron, do you have any perspective on foster care?
Well, yeah, this is a special episode, I think. I mean, largely, this is going to be the most ignorant position that we've come from in the history of the show. So it'll be I'm excited to learn a lot tonight.
Yeah.
Also, for the audience, definitely just for the audience, what is CASA?
Oh, court-appointed special advocate. So you represent the wishes of the child in court. You are a volunteer trained through a very mini program.
Oh, I never knew you did that.
Very few hours.
Huh.
Yeah, I did it before Ayla was born. No. Yeah, I did it before Ayla was born because I was like, dude, I'm about to have a second kid. I don't think I could do this anymore. Because your job is to spend a lot of time with the kids, so you know their wishes and you really know what's going on from their perspective. That's too much though. So, Now that we've established how ignorant we are, Carly, can you tell us a little bit about you, your journey, your story, and the foster care system from your perspective?
Yeah, so my husband and I became licensed foster parents a little more than 13 years ago. And the goal of foster care is always reunification when it's safe and healthy. So you're supposed to look at yourself as extended family while the child's biological family is doing whatever they need to do to get to a healthy place to get their child back in their home. And so that journey has looked very different for us than what I anticipated it looking like. We actively did foster care for 6 years. And in that 6 years, we ended up adopting 5 children, which was not the plan going into it. But our kids were with us for a number of years, and it looked like their parents were not going to be able to be in a safe position, a healthy position to be able to parent their children. So their parental rights were terminated. And when that happens, they initially ask the existing foster parent, would you be interested in adopting because you've had these kids in your home for a few years already? So at that point, we said absolutely, because they had been our kids, we had been parenting them. And even though the goal was reunification, when that changed, we had quite a bond with them at that point. So we did adopt them. But in the process of doing that, I really realized that as much as I was born in Las Vegas, I've lived here my whole life, and my husband's been in Vegas since he was 5. So we're very well knit into our city. And it didn't matter how well supported we were, that if someone else had not also engaged in foster care, they just didn't understand what we were experiencing. So we started a support group for other foster families in our home about 11 years ago. And that has grown into quite a large organization now. So I'm the director of an organization called Fostering Hope, which is essentially a support network of about 200 foster families in Clark County. And once foster families either adopt or close their license, they can maintain a part of our support group. They don't have to be actively fostering, just have been foster families at one point. So all 200 of those families are not currently fostering. I'd say about 150 of them are actively fostering right now.
And do those families reach out to you? Or like, how do they know about you?
Yep. So most of what we do, most of how our organization grows is by word of mouth. We have a resource center in Las Vegas called Hannah's Closet, which is a little boutique shop that is for foster families specifically. They can come there and shop for free. They can come up to once a month. They can get 5 full outfits per child, and that's inclusive of shoes, socks and underwear, hygiene items, all kinds of stuff. And so that is really how word of mouth spreads, because foster parents, especially that are new, they'll get a resource sheet when they finish their licensing classes, and we're listed on that resource sheet. So we're listed as our physical resource center, which is Hannah's Closet, but then also as our weekly support group.
Okay. And I don't know, how come I don't know this, but you were fostering, was it 5 siblings?
Our oldest 4 kids are biological siblings, yes. So they were our very first foster placement. We anticipated they would probably be with us 6 to 12 months, given their family history. And then they were with us for 2 years. And at that point, their mother actually relinquished her right. She made a choice on her own, knowing that she was not going to be able to parent her children in a healthy way. And so she relinquished her parental right to the court. And then we, in turn, adopted.
Does she still have a relationship with them?
She doesn't.
No. But would you...
she passed.
She what?
She passed away.
Oh. Would she have legally been able to would you have to agree to that?
Oftentimes, they will ask a foster parent to engage in what's called an open adoption agreement between a foster adoptive family and a biological family to help maintain that relationship. Just because someone is not necessarily fit to be a full-time parent doesn't necessarily mean that it's not appropriate for there to still be some type of relationship. In our situation, that was not the case. So we had what's referred to as a closed adoption, where there was not post-adoptive contact.
Okay. That's interesting.
So
did you have a question?
Yeah. So in the beginning, what led you to fostering? What made that the kind of the family choice early on?
Good question. I had a really good friend who was adopted when I was in the 3rd grade. And she was African American. Her parents were Caucasian. And I just thought, how cool that her parents chose her. Like, my parents got stuck with me, but like her parents chose her. And so from the time that I was in 3rd grade, I knew that one day I would adopt. So when my husband and I were seriously dating, I was like, hey, I'm going to adopt one day. And if you're on board with that, like, we can keep dating. And if you're not, like, you're not the guy for me. And he was fine with it. So we kept dating. And then went really shortly after we had gotten married, about 3 months after we had got married, we were actually at church, and they were recruiting foster families from the faith-based community. The Department of Family Services was. And so they had kind of sent out some flyers to different churches and just said, hey, if you're interested in foster care, attend this informational meeting to find out next steps. So we had always talked about adoption. And in my mind, that looked like international adoption. I didn't know anything about foster care. The only things I had ever heard were like negative stories on the news. But I didn't know anything at all about what the process looked like, what the intention of foster care was. And so we attended that informational session and thought that it would be a great start before we privately adopted or had biological children. And obviously, things did not turn out as we planned. They turned out better, which is great. But our foster care journey looked drastically different than what we thought foster care would look like going into it. So an example would be one of the couples that went through our licensing class with us. In the same 6 years that we did foster care, we had a total of 7 children that came through our home through foster care. 5 of those 7 we adopted. So very small numbers for the amount of time that we fostered for. The other couple that went through it with us in that same 6 years fostered 63 children.
Oh,
Wow.
Yeah, so they also had large sibling groups, but they had them for 3 months, for 6 months, for 2 weeks, and the kids were either able to reunify back to their birth family or go to an extended relative. Or because when a child first comes into foster care, say, okay, from the start, someone calls CPS. So say a neighbor or a teacher or a sports coach thinks a child might be in some type of danger. So whether that danger is physical abuse, sexual abuse, like malnourished, lack of education, lack of supervision, any of those things, someone calls CPS and they say, hey, I think so-and-so might not be in a great situation. So then CPS, Child Protective Services, they investigate. When they investigate, if it seems substantial enough that that child is legitimately in risk of harm, they will remove that child from the home. So once that child is removed from the home, they get to foster care, and simultaneously the birth parent is given a plan to start working, and that plan is written specifically for them based on the reason why their child was in care. So if it was maybe domestic abuse between 2 adults, it might be you need to separate from this person as step 1. You need to take some classes, you need to get information, you need to have some resources, those types of things. So the parent is given that case plan while the child is in foster care, but at the same time, DFS, the Department of Family Services, is actively looking for family members. So if for some reason my children were to go into foster care, at the same time, the department would be looking for my parents. Are they an option? Are my siblings an option? Are there aunts and uncles? Is there fictive kin, which is someone who is like a relative, but not blood or marriage? So maybe a neighbor that's lived next door for 20 years that you've known your whole life. Like, is that someone who would be willing to take them? Because generally speaking, kids will thrive more in a environment that they're familiar with, as opposed to being placed with complete strangers. Yeah. So the parent is given a plan to work, but at the same time, they start looking for other relatives. So I might have taken home a 5-year-old and thought, okay, I'll have this kid about 6 months while their parent works their case plan. And then tomorrow they find an aunt in Iowa that's flying out to pick him up. So they're constantly looking for relatives. And so sometimes you might take a kid home Like, we've had some foster families in Fostering Hope who have not even finished the drive home before DFS has called and said, oh, we found a relative, bring them back, which is great. That's the goal.
Yeah.
And so when that happens back to back to back, it gets exhausting. So one example, we served this one foster mom at Hannah's Closet, which is our resource center. And in the span of 3 weeks, she had 3 sibling groups of 4 that came to her with nothing. And so if she had to go out every single time and buy everything for those kids, she wouldn't have been in a financial position to keep bringing them home, because when they leave, they take all of their stuff with them. And so she was able to come each time and shop at Hannah's Closet and at least get basic necessities for each of the kids, that then when she sent them home and they left with all their stuff and she picked up another 4, we were able to help sustain her through that.
Yeah, that would be wild.
That would be. Did we say, my mind is all jumbled from our pre-show. Did we say I was on this show, or was it the pre-show what Hannah's Closet was?
I don't know, but
it was here. It was live.
It was this show.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was here in real life.
I'm glad you all paused, just so you know.
Steven has a good question. Are there a lot of orphans that come through, or is it primarily through the CPS process where it's going into unification? Do orphans end up in that system?
Generally speaking, no. How an orphan would end up in the foster care system would be, say mom, dad, and child were in a car accident. Mom and dad die in the car accident. Child survives. Well, technically that child is an orphan, and they would go into foster care while they looked for extended family. Okay. But the goal of foster care is always reunification, is the initial goal. So when people get into foster care with the intention of adopting, you can adopt through the foster care system over time. But that's never, like, it's not like you call CPS on your neighbor, it's a very grim situation, they immediately look for an adoptive home. That's not the case, because everyone is given an opportunity to work a case plan. And so if a child, there are children in the foster care system that are legally free. And what that means is that they have no parents that have a parental right. So either their parent has relinquished their right, or their parent has lost their right through the court system, but that child is not yet in an adoptive home. So those children do exist. They do need adoptive placements. But in the state of Nevada, even if you were to do a private adoption, so mom A meets mom B through a private adoption agency, they decide that she's going to adopt the baby is born, goes home with the adoptive mom. In the state of Nevada, that adoption cannot be completed legally for 6 months. A child has to reside in the adoptive home for 6 months. So a birth parent in the state of Nevada does have 72 hours to change their mind. So if I said, I want someone to adopt my baby, and then the baby is born and I'm like, oh, just kidding, I didn't really mean that, I have 72 hours to change my mind before that goes before the court. After that 72 hours, so post 72 hours before 6 months, there's no risk of that child going anywhere, but they are not legally your child until that adoption is finalized 6 months later.
Gotcha.
Interesting. That'd be so interesting. I wonder why every state, this is not something we have to talk about, just some curious, like why every state makes the rules they do, and you know what I mean? That's interesting.
I have no idea. What else is interesting is a lot of the rules of how long a child can be in foster care for is federally mandated. And so the federal mandate is that by 18 months, a child has permanency. So permanency could be going back to their birth family. Permanency could be going with a relative. Permanency could be adoption. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it always happens by 18 months, but that is the federal mandate, that is the goal. Okay. But even with that mandate, every single state is different with how what path they take to get to that point.
Okay. It seems like that's a silly mandate. Like, you can't, I mean, it's just dumb because, I mean, you're obviously, that's what you're working towards, is permanency somewhere. And so that mandate is like you said, just a goal. Like, if that's your goal. So to call it the federal government, they just want to make sure, I guess, that every state is doing their best.
It's a very positive spin like that.
Well, I imagine those rules state by state come by theoretically as specific needs of those communities differ from people in Nevada and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Instances arise.
Yeah.
So your answers to questions are so thorough that my show notes are just
I
being
have
run
one.
through here.
Do you have another
No.
question? I keep talking over you. So we hear stories of people fostering just for the money, right? And then Aaron and I were talking. And Aaron's like that wouldn't even be worth it. Like what? That doesn't make any sense. Is this a thing?
Unfortunately, it is a thing. So when my husband and I first went through our licensing classes, someone said something about if you're in it for the money, blah, blah, blah. And we kind of looked at each other and we're like, what money are they talking about? I literally had no clue when we first started that subsidy reimbursement was a thing. But it is. But it is virtually that. It's a reimbursement. So you do not drive to Child Haven and pick up a child and pick up a check. It doesn't work like that. So a child is in your home for a month before you receive reimbursement. And the numbers are not secret. You can find it on the county website. It's $680 a month per child. If you are adequately caring for a child, does $680 a month help? Absolutely. Does it cover all of their costs? No, especially not when they play sports, when they do, all of these things. Is it helpful? Yes. But no one is getting rich off of $680 a month. But there are, unfortunately, some people who do take advantage of the system. So say that, okay, this is actually a real story and a very heartbreaking story. One of the things that I've done as an adoptive parent is try to spend as much time as possible with adult adoptees. So as an adult that was adopted as a child, what can you tell me from your perspective that I can do to be a better parent to my kids? Because I was raised with my birth mom and my birth dad, who are still married to this day. And so there's so many things that my kids have experienced that I have no firsthand knowledge. So how do I parent them as well as possible? I need to find out as much information as I can from other resources. So I'm sitting having lunch. This is probably 2 years ago, with an adult adoptee who was maybe 28 at the time. And she said the foster home that she was in had quite a few foster children, and that the mom and dad, the foster parents, would eat steak for dinner, and that the children in foster care would eat top ramen. And so, that's an actual memory that she has of being a child in foster care. And so when people talk about getting rich, well, it's because you're maybe spending $50 a month on this child, and you have multiple kids in your home, and then you're spending that money on yourself. So there are a lot of checks and balances in place that should prevent that from happening. But unfortunately, there are sometimes people that slide under the radar.
Is there a need for foster? Is there not a need, but is there what is that darn word? There's where there's not enough foster families.
There is a need. We have a deficit of foster parents.
Deficit. Thank you. That's the word I was trying.
At any given time, there's between 3,500 and 4,500 kids in foster care in Clark County. Last number I got was probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago, but we had 486 foster homes in Clark County. So 486 foster homes, roughly 4,000 kids in care. So there always is a need. So a big portion of those children would be in a relative care home. So an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent. Some of them, unfortunately, are in group homes, which is not ideal. That's considered congregate care, which is where a child is essentially being raised by an institution instead of a family, which is not great. But because we have so few foster homes, that is the alternative. And then we have Child Haven, which is essentially a temporary shelter. Technically, children are not supposed to be on the Child Haven campus for more than 23 hours. Unfortunately, kids do end up spending a significant amount of time there because they just can't find enough homes. So Clark County is always looking for foster parents.
Yeah, when I was at CASA, we toured the Child Haven facility, and there was definitely kids that had been there for a while because they had. Yeah. It looked like they were making it a home, basically.
Yeah, and I will say when I first started doing foster care, in my brain, Child Haven was like a baby jail. And when I first went on campus, I was like, oh, they actually do a really good job. So not that we want kids living in congregate care by any means, but like there's a splash pad in the center, and there's like none of those fun things like compensate for parents, but it isn't baby jail, which I had like in my brain, like pictures you see of like a third world country orphanage where like they're like in a crib with rails and they don't get to leave ever. And it's not like that. If you were to think of like a typical daycare, it kind of looks more like that. And there's just shifts of people that come in and care for kids. But they do genuinely really care for the kids. They do their best to take care of them. But it is still not really a place you want to be raising children.
Yeah. With the older...
Are those people that work there volunteers generally, or?
No, they are paid staff.
Okay.
And so they have 3 shifts a day because they're people there around the clock. There are volunteers. You can be trained and licensed to be a volunteer on the Child Haven campus, but those would just be additional people. Okay. There is a full staff full time.
Yeah, when I toured it, the older kids section looked like camp to me. Like if it wasn't such a sad situation, like it would be fun.
Yeah,
like they do crafts and
yes. It's very structured. They do a very good job of trying to keep the kids engaged because their situations suck. And so like the last thing you need is a teenager pulled from a sucky situation, like laying on a bed all day doing nothing. So they do field trips. They do, like you said, organized crafts or have board game hour, or they keep them very engaged so that they try to process through the things that are going on.
A lot of the, when Aaron and I were doing some research, a lot of things that came up, the first thing when I typed in like, I typed in percentage of foster, and automatically came up foster care abuse, foster care, and all these things in that realm. Do you have the statistics up still, Aaron? It was like
28% of kids are abused while in the foster care system. However, according to a Psychology Today article, however, official statistics may be severely underestimating the problem, since foster kids are often conditioned not to speak up about the abuse they endure.
You're talking about abuse that continues to happen once in the foster home?
Yeah. Abuse from the foster family.
Yeah. I would like to think that 25% of the foster parents I know do not abuse their children. But I will also say that the foster families that are in our network are, generally speaking, I would say 97% of the time, are people that really genuinely want to do it for the right reason. Like they have a goal of making a positive impact in the community. Some of them, it's like their second wave of children. They've raised children to adulthood and then retired and then been like, what do I do now? And so we have a lot of retirees that do foster care. We have a lot of people that do foster care just because they maybe didn't have a great childhood and they want to be able to have a positive impact in the next generation. So I do feel like a lot of our foster families do it for the right reason. And whenever I sit down with someone who's interested in foster care, my goal is to try to talk them out of it, because I feel like if I can talk you out of being a foster parent in 1 hour, you are not going to make it. Because retention is really a challenge everywhere in the United States, but specifically in Las Vegas. And part of that is because we're such a transient city. People come and go all the time, but also people in Las Vegas tend to not have extended family. And so not only does that increase our numbers of why kids go into foster care, but that increases numbers of why potential quality foster parents can't foster. And so when Fostering Hope started working very closely with the Department of Family Services, one of the things we did was say, if you came and taught your very same classes that you teach at your county building downtown, if you taught them on our church campus, which is in the south end of Las Vegas, and we provided space for free and we provided childcare for free, would that be a service to you? And they were like, yes, absolutely. And so back in 2017, we started hosting those classes on our church campus, just as a way to make it more accessible to families. But also, if you were a potential family that had biological children and you had no close friends or family in Las Vegas that could watch your kids while you go to classes for 3 hours a week for 10 weeks, like that's a huge expense up front that not only is that not even possible for some people because of the expense, but it's not even possible because they don't even know anyone that could do that for them if they could afford it. And so that's been a really cool relationship that we have with the county to be able to offer that. And that has been another way that families have funneled into our group, is just through that, through exposure and being on our campus. I don't know where we were going with that. What did you even ask me?
About the risk of abuse in homes.
Oh, of abuse, yes.
Oh.
And so I feel like when foster parents get to that breaking point where they maybe feel super stressed, or because the reality is there is no child that's in the foster care system that has not experienced a lot of trauma. They wouldn't be in foster care otherwise. And so even if that was removal at birth, you're not with your biological mother whose belly you just grew in for 9 months. And so like there's trauma, even if there's not trauma on paper. And so I feel like there's a lot of behaviors that as a foster parent you have to deal with that you do not feel qualified to handle, and all of a sudden like you're knee deep in it. And so when someone is able to walk away from a situation where potentially a foster parent could get to the boiling point of harming a child, they can come to our support group and they can say, hey, I'm really struggling with this. Do you have any advice? I mean, there's things that, like, not to be too graphic, but things that we deal with that I feel like in a regular circle of biological parents is not like general topic. Like, how's the poop smearing going at your house? That's, that's not something that like typical parents deal with. Like, sure, you might have a newborn that like, not a newborn, a toddler that takes off their diaper and like, makes a big old mess. And then you figure out you put their pajamas on backwards and it's fine. Well, when we've got 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds that are intentionally like poop smearing on the walls because it's one thing they have control over, that's something that it can get someone to reach their boiling point very quickly. But when you understand trauma and you understand how to handle it, and you have a support network of people that are walking alongside you in that, I think you're less likely to have a reaction.
Yeah, and I would think the people that reach out to you are, in my head, and this is all theory, but based off solid feelings, that that the people who reach out to you really wouldn't be those that tended towards the abuse anyway. In my head, the people who are doing it for money, like you said, are probably the people who tend towards abuse. And the poop smearing is funny only because my mom tells that story where she couldn't take my foster brother and I into the store at the same time because he hated me so much. And when she came back in, we had a van with carpeted walls, like back in the 70s, and he had spread poop all over the carpet of the van.
I mean, there's things like that, poop smearing, for example, that when you really get down to like the core of what it is, it's heartbreaking. Yeah. And so when you understand that, you have compassion. But when you don't understand that, like oftentimes children that do things like poop smearing are kids that have experienced sexual abuse. And so in that child's mind, if I make my body as disgusting as possible, someone's not going to touch me. And so it's a protective mechanism of like, what can I do to make this adult who's being a predator not want anything to do with me? And so you think poop is gross. So if my body is covered in poop, they're not going to touch me. And so there's things like that once you know that, like, gosh, that breaks your heart, and you don't jerk and they're just trying to be disgusting. And
do they cover things like that in the classes as well that you have to attend?
They do. I mean, there's so many specific things. They give a high level, like a 30,000 foot view of a lot of different things. But I mean, really, it's until you've experienced, I'm sure, just like being a teacher, right? You can only learn so much in a college setting. And then when you're in a classroom of 35 fifth graders who smell terrible and are all yelling at you, that like things are different just practically than they are when you learn them. Yeah. And totally. So there's things like that when you're sitting in a support group, we've had people that have come to a support group for the first time, just like at their wit's end. And you can just see them sitting there while other people are sharing, and they just start crying because for the first time, they don't feel alone. And so feeling like, okay, yes, what I'm doing is really hard, but there's a purpose behind it, right? Like I'm doing this to try to positively impact the next generation. And I would also say that I'd say probably this is not an actual statistic. This is just from my personal experience. I'd say probably 80% of children that are in foster care, their parent was in foster care. And so they have no example of how to be a quality parent. They had no one that supported them. And so it's just patterns of behavior that's generational. And so, like, how do we not only care for this child in foster care, but how do we care for that birth parent and get them into a place where they also are well supported, where they're receiving the resources that they need, where they have a support network, so that if we can break the generational cycles of lack of education, of lack of resources, of, you know, all these things, like, that's how we're going to impact the next generation of children in foster care. It's to eliminate it.
Yeah.
But that's only going to happen by making impact in the families, by having healthy families, by, you know, like there's so many things like that. So in this last like year and a half, Fostering Hope has started working on a birth parent model. So we're still recruiting foster parents, we're still walking alongside foster parents, but like if the goal of foster care is reunification, and we have these kids in our homes that we love on for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, and we know that these children are going to go back to that family, well, don't we want them to go back to the best family possible? And so what are we doing to make it so that when they reunify, that it's a healthy reunification, that it's a reunification that is sustainable? If we're only giving them resources so they can get their kid back, and then we stop those resources once they get their kid back, like how unrealistic is that?
Yeah.
And so we're working on biofamily support groups. So this has not launched yet, but we're working on biofamily support groups. So it would be just like our foster parent support group, except for biofamilies. So it would be biofamilies in all stages, maybe that currently don't have their kids or that just received back their kids. And then some foster families that have walked foster parents that have walked very closely to help biofamilies get their kids back, that can like mentor them and say like, you know, this is what was really helpful for this person. This is what wasn't so helpful. But that long term, that's the only way that we're going to be able to impact things is to make actual change in the family. Otherwise, it's just a cycle that's going to keep going.
Absolutely.
As a foster parent, are you ever given the opportunity to build a relationship with the children's biological family, like through that whole process, that you can actually participate individually on an individual basis through that kind of thing?
Yep. So foster families, I would say generally speaking, have visitation 1 to 2 times a week. So sometimes, depending on the reason why that child is in care, usually if it's any reason other than violent, it will be an unsupervised visit. So if I'm the birth parent and you're the foster parent, we're going to pick a mutual place where we can meet. It's going to be at a play place at a fast food establishment. And we're going to hang out there for an hour while you engage with your kid. And the goal is that I help pour into you at that time. I update you on things that are happening with the kid. I invite you to their doctor's appointment or their speech appointment. And that's not always received well. Some birth parents feel like a foster parent is the enemy, you know, like they're against them. But I would say most of the time it's well received.
That's nice.
Yes.
I'm trying to picture that. I can imagine that a lot of foster parents might be hostile, or angry. I know. I just think of the ones that we've talked to.
The
What's
birth
that?
parent might be hostile, or the foster parent?
The birth parents. Thank
Okay.
you. It's late. It's
It is
7:40
late. Yeah, it
here.
is. It's definitely late. I can still see the sun, but only through my monitors.
I was like, really?
So Steven, man after my heart, is asking, how much information do you get about the biological parents, and have you or anybody you know, being recipients of in foster care, had an issue with the case that brought them into your care?
Okay, say the first part of the question again.
How much information are you given about the reason that they
The
were brought
case
into your
itself.
care?
Sometimes a lot, sometimes literally zero. It is very case dependent. Sometimes a caseworker legitimately doesn't know. A placement worker might have received this child. The child came in the middle of the night. Their file has not arrived at the office yet. They just know they need to find this child a home. So the placement team might call me and say, hey, we have a 4-year-old boy. We don't know anything. Cool. So either, depending on my personality and what I've got planned the next week, I might say, great, I'll come pick him up. Or I might say, you know what, I need more information on that. And they'll say, we're sorry, we don't have any more information. We're calling the next person. Sometimes they do have a lot of information. Sometimes children end up in care multiple times. So they might say, this is this child's second time in care. Before, the child was in care for X number of months. They were back with their mom for 2 years. Now they're in care again for this. So sometimes they do have a lot of information. But it really is, I don't feel like, in my experience, placement workers don't lie to you. Their goal is for that placement to be as successful as possible. That makes their job easier. The more times they have to place a child, the harder it is on them. So they're not going to tell you misinformation on purpose, because inadvertently that makes their job harder. But I do think legitimately there are some times when a placement worker just doesn't have information to give. Okay, now what was the second part? I forgot that now.
Have you or any foster care parents had an issue with the information on the case for the birth parents, as to, like, if you feel like it was handled unfairly or anything of that nature?
Like CPS was being unfair, or you disagree what CPS was saying or doing?
You mean as far as like why a child was in care in the first place?
Yeah.
It's hard. I think the child abuse hotline gets like a few hundred calls a day. I would say one downside about Clark County is it's one county that's way too big. And so that negatively impacts our education system, that negatively impacts our family services. So there's things where, how much can you adequately filter 300 phone calls a day? I mean, it's just a numbers game, right? So if of these 300 calls that come through, this intake worker feels like, okay, this is highest priority. So a child protective services worker, a CPS worker, goes out and starts investigating these calls. You never know. Like, I mean, you could show up at a parent's house and they could be having a bad day, right? Like, I don't know if you're a parent, Aaron. Do you have any children?
No, ma'am.
You don't. This would not happen to you. But if they showed up at your house and you were just having a crappy day, like, that CPS worker might be like, yeah, this is a pretty rough situation. I think these kids need to come out. Where you might also, on the flip side, have a birth parent who has made a lot of really terrible choices, but on the day the CPS worker shows up, they're clean, they're coherent, and the CPS worker is like, oh, I don't think this is a big deal. And so, like, you can't blame the CPS worker for that, right? They come in and they see what they see. They can't review tape of what has happened in your home the last 24 or 48 hours. There's not, it's all humans, so there's a lot of human error. So do I think, again, that they do their best job possible? I do think so. I don't think anyone is like, you know what, I'm going to get into child welfare because I'm going to make it rich. Like, nobody does that. You don't get paid a ton of money to be a social worker.
Yeah.
And so I think people do it because it's what they feel called to do. It's what they feel like will make the most impact, or what they want to do with their lives. But I think there's obviously room for error. So I have seen some kids that have been in care where it's like, you know what, like, yeah, you made some pretty poor choices, but I think you were a safe enough parent. And I've also seen times when a child has reunified to a parent that I didn't agree with, when I felt like, you know what, that parent probably needed a little bit more support before we placed that child back with them. And then, unfortunately, because of lack of judgment or because of the family not being quite ready yet, that child does end up back in foster care, which is rough. And so I think that, again, I think they do as good of a job as possible, but, so.
In those situations after reunification, do foster parents ever maintain a relationship with the birth parents?
That obviously depends on the foster parent and the birth parent. We have seen both. We recently had a foster parent, actually, she by choice still co-parents with the birth mom. She feels like the mom's emotional capacity is not at a healthy enough place where she could parent around the clock as a single parent without breaks and be successful. So this foster parent by choice still has that child about 3 days out of every 10-day cycle. And they have continued that for years. And that has enabled the mom to be a healthy, functioning single parent. And it has enabled that foster parent to maintain that connection with the child. And so obviously that's rare. That doesn't happen very often. But when it does happen, it can be a really awesome thing.
Yeah, it sounds amazing.
That is awesome. Yeah, I'm impressed. So besides the 10 weeks of classes, what other approvals or things do foster families have to do?
So initially, before you even started classes, you would do a background check, because what's the point of taking classes if you're not going to clear a background check? So they do that first, which is sensible. It's 30 hours of licensing classes. And so it used to be 10 weeks. I think it's 8 weeks now, and you do some of it online at home. You have to do a car seat training class if you're taking children that are under the age of 8. You have to be CPR certified. You have to be TB tested. You have a home inspection, which they come out to your home twice. So initially they come out, they go through your space, and they essentially leave with a checklist of things you need to accomplish before the next time they come back. And so a lot of things are kind of silly, if you ask me. You have to have a fire extinguisher on both floors. But if my house is on fire, I'm just getting out and calling 911. I'm not going to go hunt down the fire extinguisher. Maybe some people would. That's not my personality. I'm let's get out of here. So you have to have a smoke detector in each room. If you have a 2-story house, you have to have a fire escape ladder on the 2nd floor. So there's some things like that are home requirements. You have to have any medication locked up. Cleaners have to be locked up. But just a child lock cabinet,
Oh, okay.
So none of it is super extreme, but it is just kind of annoying stuff that you're I wouldn't do this if this was my biological 10-year-old. So why am I doing it for this 10-year-old? But yeah, that's just what the rules are.
It seems like there would be a benefit, perhaps a benefit, considering the amount or perceived amount of abuse that occurs, for a psychological test or something, or maybe that goes against rights.
No, they don't do a psychological test, but there is part of the home study is you have to answer a pretty in-depth questionnaire. And it does talk about a lot of things that I did not expect going into it. It talks about your own personal sexual history, if you've had any abuse in your history, if you've had substance abuse, all sorts of things. So they do try to weed people out like that also. And that's pretty in-depth. It's on
a form though? You fill it out, paper, pencil?
You do fill it out, yes, but then also it is discussed with your licensing worker.
Okay, that's what.
So I do feel there are some checks and balances in place as far as that goes. And if you adopt, there's an even more in-depth one of those before an adoption would be final.
It's a catch-22. I hear stories of like you said, just to adopt, a family has to do these 800 bazillion things that make no sense, that you would never do for a biological child, just to and prevents a lot of people from adopting when we need adoptive parents. But then I think, well, maybe not enough is done. You know what I mean? Because so many placements, not so many, but if it's a quarter of children that are abused, and that's a high number. And
I wonder if that number takes into account child-on-child abuse, because I would wonder if, say you have a 10-year-old in a home who has experienced some sexual abuse himself, and then he acted out on an 8-year-old, I wonder if that is brought into those numbers.
So it did have, it separated it by, if they were put in with the family care. Like, so there has been some abuse when they were in foster care with a family member
And
versus a foster. Yeah, versus a foster family. Yeah. So there was that, but it didn't say anything about like child. That is an interesting. Now I'm trying to find. It says nothing. Also, your husband asks, "Has your child ever lit a tree in your backyard on fire?" I'm guessing the answer to that is yes.
that is yes. My very inquisitive child. I will say that when we went through our licensing classes, they talk about all these extremes that could happen. And one extreme they talk about is a child starting a fire in your home. And we have had that happen twice. Once on our bedroom carpet. Thankfully, that was put out very quickly. And the other time was in our backyard. And in his defense, we had just gotten home from camping, and he has always been very interested in fire. I don't think he's like an arsonist or anything. He just is captivated by it, which, like, what little boy isn't? So we came home from camping, and he was playing in the backyard, lighting charcoal briquettes on fire. And to hide the evidence, once he had blown them out, he shoved them in the corner of the yard where we had just had our trees trimmed and all the brush was there that hadn't gone out for bulk pickup yet. Ooh. And so for 2 hours, nothing happened while that briquette sat there and simmered. And then all of a sudden, 25-foot palm tree fully engulfed in flames. So.
Wow. I would just like to point out, especially in his defense, that this is not an incident isolated to foster children. There's somebody on this call who also was obsessed with fire.
And I'm definitely not an arsonist.
Well, I don't know.
Only alleged arsonist.
Oh, Steven has another good question. Steven's usually Aaron's dying now because he related so much. Are there activities you're not allowed to involve the foster kids in, like church, rated R movies?
That's a really great question.
Right?
So if a child wants to attend church, that is their choice. So if I have a 6-week-old foster placement, am I going to say, do you want to go to church, and wait for a response? No, they're just going to go with me. But as soon as a child is old enough to make a decision and have an opinion, they can choose not to go. And as the foster parent, you do have to accommodate that. You also do have to accommodate any of their religious preferences, even if they go against your own. So if my husband and I are Christians and we bring in a child that is of a Muslim belief, then it would be my job as his foster parent to find a mosque or something for him to go to that would accommodate what he believes.
Wow, that'd be hard.
It would be hard. And so sometimes if that's something, I would say there are very few times where that is the case. Most of the time, the child just wants to be a part of whatever the family is doing. So whether or not they believe what you believe, they're still going to go with you because they want to be with you. They want to do whatever the whole family unit is doing. They don't want to feel isolated. They already feel isolated. And so they're probably going to go with you even if they just drowned out everything that's being said. They just want to be around you. But they do have the choice to not go. So also, depending on a child's case, would be whether or not they would be allowed to leave the county. Most of the time.
That was his next question. You're a genius.
Most of the time, if you were going on a family trip, they want you to include that child as your family as much as possible. So if my family is going to California for the weekend to go camping, that child is going to come with us unless there is some reason why they can't. So very rarely a child will not be allowed to leave the county. But that is very, very few and far between. Most of the time, you just have to let the caseworker know the address of where you're staying, the dates that you're going to be gone for. And then if that child is going to miss a visit with their birth family, you would just want to have like a makeup session for whatever visit they would be missing. One thing that you are not allowed to do is leave the country with that child. So okay. I did hear one time of a judge making a override. I don't know what the word is I'm looking for. Special acceptance, whatever. And a child was able to go with a family because it was some sort of, I don't remember, a religious something that child was also a part of. And so they went to like Israel or something. I'm probably screwing up the whole story, but whatever it was.
I get the idea.
Yeah. One time a child was allowed to leave the country. usually they have to just stay. They can travel with you wherever as long as it's in the United States.
What about things like the rated R movies and stuff like that? Is it like
you're
like
supposed to parent that child however you would parent your birth parent. So
okay.
if you asked my husband, could a teenager watch a rated R movie? He'd say sure. If you asked me, I'd say no. So depends on who's home at the time. So yeah, they have in Clark County, they have what's called a normalcy policy. So they want you to make an informed decision for the child that's in your care as if they were your child. So if I'm going to sign my birth child up to play on a soccer team, I'm going to sign my child in care up to play for a sport. If we're all going to go together to the water park, we're all going to go do it together. If we're going to watch a movie, well, I might have a 18-year-old and I might have a 9-year-old. So I'm going to make different decisions for them based on that, but not based on the fact that one is in care and one isn't.
Gotcha. And my last question is, how do you think the system handles aging out?
Terribly.
I thought so, but I didn't want to imply it.
I think that they try, but there's a lot. It's a much more complicated thing than it appears. So if a child has been in foster care and has experienced a lot of trauma over the course of their life, the day they turn 18, are they ready to be an adult?
I wasn't even ready to be an adult.
Yeah, I think most children, period, the day they turn 18 are not ready to be adults. And so what do? When a child in care turns 18, do you just say, okay, high five, have a great life? Like that's rough. So a child in care can choose to stay in care beyond the age of 18. They can actually choose to stay in foster care until they're 21.
Oh.
There are a couple of, so that monthly reimbursement that we talked about, that can continue to go to the foster parent. It can stay just as if that child is in foster care for years beyond 18, or if that child participates in an aging out program, that child would then start receiving that monthly subsidy, and the child and the foster parent would sit down and say, okay, you're receiving $600 a month, you're going to pay $150 a month for rent and utilities, and then I'm going to help you build a budget, I'm going to help you. So they really do try to get them like acclimated to grown-up life. They don't like kick them to the curb at 18. But all that to say, I do think that they could still do a better job. But part of that is how much at 18 do those kids want to engage with learning how to do a budget and learning how to, do all these grown-up things. Most kids, especially now, don't. Like I had a sit-down conversation the other day with a group of kids who were between like 18 and 20, and the amount of them that did not have a driver's license was appalling to me.
Right.
Like, I don't know what has happened with people in the last 20 years, but like when I was in like 15 and a half, the day I turned 15 and a half, I went and got my permit. Driving was very scary, and it did take me a little bit longer than 16 to get my license. But like every single person I knew, it was like their 16th birthday and they were going to get the license.
On my 16th birthday.
Yeah, now kids are like, meh.
But Aaron didn't drive forever.
18.
He didn't care. Oh,
18.
Down there.
Yeah.
You were 18? That's crazy.
I had too much going on with band, I tell you. Too much going
there
on.
are some kids that are very responsible and just have a lot going on. But for the most part, I feel like we have, unfortunately, a generation of kids who have not really like grown up in reality. They've like grown up online, which is weird to me. And so like you have all these like late teens who have like never had a job, who like don't know how to order at a restaurant, who can't make eye contact with grown-ups. Like it's weird to me. We were out to eat probably a month ago, and the server had pulled me aside as we were leaving, and she said, when your kids all looked up at me and ordered their own food, she was like, I almost didn't know how to react because kids don't know how to order food anymore. And I'm like, that's so weird to me because we don't coddle our kids. My goal as a parent is to help you be a really successful grown-up. Yeah. And so like I have to start working on that now. I can't decide to treat you like a grown-up the day you turn 18, or like we're all in a lot of trouble. Yeah. It was a very roundabout way to say that I think that there's a lot of room for growth in how we're handling kids that turn 18 in the department. But I do think it is not what most people have the impression of. Like, they don't literally get kicked out of foster care at 18.
Well, and unfortunately, they have to choose
Mm-hmm.
to do it. And I'm just thinking of, I can't remember why I was involved with kids aging out of the system. I don't know if it's when I was in CASA or maybe I did something else. I have no idea, but it's in my head somewhere. But that there was a lot of struggle with a couple of the teens. But even at that point, I didn't realize that there were options, and they basically chose
Yeah.
to leave the system. But
Well,
in their defense too, they might have experienced trauma in the system itself. So
but what else is really a bummer that I think a lot of people don't think about is, okay, so that child has turned 18. They've aged out of the system. So they've not been able to go back to their birth family, and they've also not been adopted. So what happens when you're 20 and it's Thanksgiving? Or what happens when you're 22 and your tire blows out on the freeway? Or what happens, like, for literally the rest of your life? Like, I'm 36. Do you want to know how many times I call my dad? Like, Dad, can you come help me build this table? Dad, can you, like, I think people don't realize that, like, yes, they're adults, but they still need a family.
yeah.
And so, like, how are we just as a community coming around these kids who have unfortunately aged out of the foster care system, but they still need a family? So where can they go and have dinner on a Sunday? Or who can they call when they, don't know how to apply for an apartment, or what, all these things? Who do they put down as an emergency contact on a medical form? All these things that, like, how do we blame kids by kids, I mean 18-year-olds, for the decisions they make when they have no one to turn to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, a lot of the statistics were that, a lot of them end up homeless. And these statistics are regarding foster kids in general, and has more to do, I think, with the trauma they've experienced than the foster care system itself. But that 50% of foster kids never graduate from high school or get a GED. And that's right there. That's a ding when you turn 18, right? Of your options in life.
And in the state of Nevada, we actually were a part of getting something passed that if you are in foster care for even one day beyond the age of 14 in the state of Nevada, that you can go to any one of our 7 state schools for free for your whole education. And so, like, working on getting things like that taken care of, so that, like, that's one less thing that a child who either ages out of the system, or even if they have permanency, even if they go back to their biological family, or if they're adopted, like, how can we help them be successful? Like, if you are in foster care as a teenager, like, the odds are stacked against you. So what can we do to help you be successful? Well, one of those things we can do is help pay for higher education. And so there haven't been that many kids that have taken advantage of it. I think part of that is them not knowing. And so we're working on awareness for that. But also, okay, so this kid who aged out of the system, who has no family, has college paid for, but where do they go over Christmas break when the dorms are closed? So there's still, like, it's still an uphill battle, even though we're helping provide services. And so whenever I meet with someone who's like 45 and they're like, oh, I just wish I could have done it sooner. Like, I'm too old now. And I'm like, yeah, right. You could foster a 15-year-old and it would be like you started when you were 30. Like, yeah, you're young again. So here you go. It's not too late.
Is it terrible that the first thing I thought of when you said even one day in the foster care system, I'm like, how could I get the kids in the foster care system for one day?
Awful. You're awful.
It would not be worth it. But I'm just saying, like, if we were, like, really poor and I wanted them to go to college.
So to that point about not being too old, can you just give us your sales pitch for anybody that might be on the fence, anybody thinking about it? Why foster kids?
Yeah, I think, like I have said a lot, that it is literally the only way that we can change the next generation. If we want to impact things in our city, like homelessness, like crime, like human trafficking, like, literally the core of all of that is children that go into foster care. And so unless we're going to stop it at its core, all we're doing is putting Band-Aids on things. And so if you have ever not been happy about the amount of homeless, or if you've ever not been thrilled when you hear numbers of human trafficking, or all of these things, if you're upset about the crime rate, like literally the thing to do to put action to it is to become a foster parent. And so not everyone is in a place where they can become a foster parent, whether that's your health, whether that's your living situation, but what could you do to support the foster community? And so Hannah's Closet is completely run by volunteers. You can come and work a 3-hour shift there anytime. You could bring a meal to a new foster family. You could offer to do weekly homework help to a child in foster care. I mean, there literally is like an endless number of ways that whatever talent you have could be used for someone in foster care. So one example really quick is there was this old retired guy named Joe, and all he would do every Saturday was drive around and mow the lawn of single foster moms. And like, you might not think that that's a very big deal, but to those single foster moms who didn't have to cut their grass was like huge. And as far as Joe was concerned, like, he didn't like people. He didn't have to talk to anybody, like literally zero human interaction at all. But he was serving a handful of families on a weekly basis that in turn, because that foster parent didn't have to worry about cutting their grass, was able to reinvest that time into a child. And so there's a ton of ways that like literally anything you do you cut hair? Do you fix plumbing? I mean, anything. Like there is a way that that can be used to serve a child in foster care.
That is awesome. And if you are interested, we don't have Carly's contact info.
No, is there a website for Hannah's Closet?
There is. So Hannah's Closet and Fostering Hope is a part of a network of organizations in Las Vegas called The Hub. So thehublv.com. And under the Hub umbrella, we have Fostering Hope, which is foster care. We have the Love Well, which is a poverty and homeless outreach. We have Purchased, which is an anti-human trafficking campaign. And so all of us work together to try to still change in our community. And so thehublv.com is our website where you could literally sign up to volunteer for anything. My email address is Carly, Carly, at thehublv.com. And so if somebody doesn't know how to use a website, they can email me.
You're speaking to some of our audience.
And if anybody's watching this after the fact, we will have the links to the website down in the description.
And we do have, I just want to point out, we do have an observer, a watcher. Who are the people watching our show? There's watchers.
This is
Viewers, thank you. Dude, we have a viewer who I think might have been in the foster care system who made a good point about teaching kids more about like sustainability, like living wise, like growing their own food and stuff, which I think is a super awesome idea. On a side note, in Vegas it's a little more difficult, but shout out to you, viewer.
My dad lives in Las Vegas and he manages to grow stuff, and I don't know how. I'm just now getting to the point where I can keep plants alive, which is huge. I'm very proud of myself. But he like grows enough things that you could like make salsa from his garden, or you could make spaghetti sauce, or like so many things. And I'm like, I don't know how you do it in literally the heart of Las Vegas. So just got a massive green thumb.
That's insane. Yeah, I can barely keep I have this aloe plant that is supposed to survive anything apparently, so that's where we're at right now. I've killed many cactuses. I feel like I'm just like a plant kind of murderer. I'm like, I see you in the store and I take you home knowing that you will die. Like I'm basically stealing you to kill you.
So dark.
That's what happens. I have good like hope that it'll stay alive, but it doesn't. It just doesn't. Oh, thank you so much, Carly. This was excellent, and I felt very like positive episode. A lot of times we leave and it's kind of like a downer, but this is good. This is great information, and thank you for all the knowledge and awareness and the resources available to people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had no idea.
This was great. Thank
you. Yeah.
And please, everybody, like, comment, subscribe, share this with your friends so that they have an idea, so they can go from as ignorant as we were to thinking about getting into it and actually being foster parents and helping their communities, because that's the best thing you can do is be a part of your community. Next week we're
dark.
We're dark next week.
We're dark next week.
Sorry, everybody, for the surprise.
Surprise! We're dark next week. I'll be in Hawaii.
And we can't get any of her time in Hawaii.
I'm worried about the internet, and you know my internet blows goats in regular life. Imagine in Hawaii.
Fair enough. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you in 2 weeks, and until then, have meaningful conversations.